This is philosopher of religion Richard Swinburne. He's one of the greatest living philosophers of religion, most people would say. One of his most famous books was called The Coherence of Theism, which presents a cumulative case for believing the worldview of monotheism. And I believe the first edition of The Coherence of Theism came out in 1977. It's been through at least one more edition since then. Um, his case for God's existence he reformulated not too many years ago in a shorter book called Is There a God? And in chapter 5 of that book, he gives a really interesting argument for substance dualism, for belief in souls, which depends on a thought experiment about brain division. But first, we need to get some terminology on the table. Suppose we have an object like an apple, not that kind of apple. Yeah. So an apple is an example of a substance that is just an individual thing, a real entity. And you distinguish that from a property, a feature had by a substance. So this apple has a bunch of properties: redness, crunchiness, being 70 degrees, having a certain mass, having been picked from a tree a month ago. And then there are events. An event is a substance having a property at a time. So the apple's being red now, that's an event that's occurring now. The apple's being eaten tomorrow, that's an event that will occur tomorrow. The apple hanging from the tree a month ago, that's an event that occurred a month ago. And Swinburne would say that you could think of the history of the cosmos as just the sum total of all events that there are. Now, something like an apple only has physical properties, the kinds of properties that are investigated by biology and chemistry and physics. But some substances are more complicated than that, and they don't just have physical properties. So, for instance, consider this bored-looking orangutan. And now this orangutan has physical features such as having reddish-brown fur, weighing 250 pounds, um, being able to lift 100 pounds with one arm, having long fingers. And this orangutan also has mental properties, such as the property of being bored. Or maybe he's thinking to himself, I wonder what's on TV tonight. He's a big fan of reality TV shows, and he wants to catch up with the gang and what's going on with it. Um, so a creature like this, a substance like this, has both physical and mental properties, and so it undergoes both physical and mental events. Swinburne defines a mental event as an event to which someone has privileged access. So this orangutan is just directly aware of his boredom. You and I are not aware of it in the same way. We might sort of reason to the conclusion that he's bored, but we're not directly aware of his boredom. Or suppose he just had a bad banana and he has a stomach ache right now. The orangutan here is directly aware of his pain, his stomach pain. And you and I are not. Maybe we can see him grimacing, maybe we can see him holding his belly, but we don't have privileged access to that mental event of being in pain, whereas the orangutan does. And we don't have unique privileged access to his thoughts about what's on TV tonight, but he does. Mental events are funny that way. For any mental event, there's someone that has privileged access to it. It's only the subject of the event which has privileged access to it. Whereas a physical event is an event to which no one has privileged access. Right? The event of his having reddish brown fur, I mean, we can know about that just the same way he can know about it, by looking at it, right? Nobody has special kind of insight into that, special kind of epistemic access. His physical property of weighing 300 pounds, you could weigh him, I could weigh him. Nobody has privileged access to that. He doesn't know it any more easily or directly than you and I know it. Okay, so Swinburne says we all know that there are physical events and mental events, and there's this interesting difference between physical and mental events. On these definitions, no physical event is a mental event, and vice versa. No mental event is a physical event. They're defined as mutually exclusive. Now, so far, Swinburne has been arguing for what we would call property dualism. The idea that there are two different kind of properties, and also event dualism, the doctrine that there are two fundamental kinds of events. A lot of philosophers accept property and event dualism, but they deny substance dualism, so they don't believe in souls. This type of position, which is very popular, is called dual aspect monism. Monism, there's only one kind of substance in the cosmos, physical substances, but they have two different kinds of properties, physical and mental, and they undergo two different kinds of events. Another name for this is non-reductive physicalism. You can't say that mental properties just are physical properties. You can't reduce the mental to the physical. They really are different. But still, as far as substances, as far as things, there's only one kind of thing, physical thing. So this is what most naturalists think. Of course, Swinburne is not a naturalist, and he's not a dual aspect monist either. And this is kind of a worrisome position uh, for a naturalist to hold. If everything there is a physical thing, then where did this entirely different class of properties come from? Um, how could there be a whole range of properties such that they would not be included even in an ideal physics? We assume an ideal physics would not include things like pain or thinking about television or uh, anything mental. So it's a matter of debate within philosophy whether non-reductive physicalism is a coherent position to take. A lot of philosophers think it is, but it's a matter of controversy. Some suspect that if you're going to be a consistent naturalist and a consistent physicalist, you'd have to believe that all properties are physical properties. But Swinburne says, no, look, they're just different. We know there are both kinds of properties, something we directly experience. We know there are both kinds of events. Okay, so let's get on to Swinburne's argument for substance dualism. It's very interesting. And the first thing to note is that a person can survive with half of their brain. There are certain diseases that result in half of your brain um, being destroyed, and then the person can just live with the other half. And somehow the other half ends up doing all the work that was previously done by both halves together. Um, and there have been people that have had part of their brain taken out and survived. So suppose we take an initial person, and let's call this person P1, person 1, and we divide their brain in half, and we install each half of the brain into a different body, which has been prepared for this purpose. So let's call one of them, whoops, let's call one of them P2, person number 2, and then there's P3. So person number 2 gets the left half, or we should say it's the person that results when you take this body with no brain and add that half of the brain to it, the resulting living being, that's person 2. You take the right half of the brain and put it in this empty head and call that resulting person person 3. And so suppose this were to be done to you. Suppose we took you, opened your head up, cut your brain in half, put half of that brain in one body and half that brain in another body, sew up those bodies properly, um, see them through their recovery period, and then we end up with 2 living human beings. And the question is, which one of them would be you? Well, you might want to know if you were going to do this. There's only a couple of possibilities, right? We can go through all of them right here and just list them out. The first possibility is that you would be the person that got the left half, right? Or maybe it turns out you would be the person that got the right half. Now you might say, yeah, what if I was both? What if I was the same, numerically the same as person 2, and also I was numerically the same as person 3? Well, you might think that's a possibility, but we'll come back to that in a second. And the only other option seems to be that you would be identical to neither one. So you're either this guy, or you're both, or you're neither, right? Those are all the possibilities. So let's put that fourth possibility here. That person 1 is not identical to person 2, and also person 1 is not identical to person 3. So left, right, both, or neither. Now we can rule out one of these options just on the grounds of logic alone. Can you see which one it is? Well, that's the third one that's incoherent. This is not a possibility at all. It's contradictory. Right? And here's why. Identity is transitive. If one thing's identical to a second, and it's identical to a third, then the first thing's identical to the third. So just in general terms, for any A, B, and C, if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then it logically follows that A is identical to C, right? If A and B are just one thing, B and C are just one thing, then A and C are really just one thing, right? So look, if P1 is identical to P2, and P2 is also and P1 is also identical to P3. Things that are identical to the same thing are identical to each other, right? So if P1's identical to P2, P1's also identical to P3, then P2 is identical to P3. They're really just one and the same thing. But look, they're not. They're not numerically the same person at all. Right, we know that P2 is not identical to P3 because one of them's over here and one of them's over here. Right, one guy got out of the hospital and went to Hawaii. The other guy got out of the hospital and went on vacation to London. So you know they're not the same person. And so this option, the third option, turns out to be incoherent. This is not a consistent possibility. So it turns out really there are only three options. You would either be the left-hand person, the left part of the brain person, or you'd be the right part of the brain person, or you'd be neither, which is just the same as saying that this operation would destroy you, right? That by dividing your brain and divvying out the parts, we would be making you cease to exist, and then out of your leftovers, maybe two new people would come to exist. And you might say, well, look, does it really matter which one of the two would be me, whether it's the left or right or neither? Well, absolutely it matters. Suppose the left part of the brain person is going to be given $1,000,000, and suppose the right-hand person is going to be tortured to death. So yes, it does matter. If this was going to be done to you, you would want to know, what am I about to face? Am I about to be annihilated? Or am I about to be given a new body and get $1,000,000? Or am I going to be the person that ends up getting tortured to death? So you can't say it doesn't matter. It does matter. Swinburne's point is that you wouldn't know which one is me until you knew where my soul went. In other words, you knew where the subject of those non-physical properties went. And so it follows that there's more to you than their body. That there's more to a person than their body. And we'll finish this up in the next